Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the IMPLAN webinar on carbon emission reporting. We have some people still straggling in here, so we're going to give it a couple minutes and we'll kick things off. Good afternoon once again, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on our webinar talking about carbon emission reporting. Today, our presentation is going to be led by the esteemed Maria Lucas, who is our technical product manager here at IMPLAN. And Candy Kloss, I'll be sitting here on the sidelines to help answer questions and launch some things inside of the webinar. So if you do have a question, you can feel free to raise your hand at any point. And at the end, we will have that open up for questions. You can also pop a question in the chat, and I will answer the easy ones live and then hold the scope 1, 2, and 3 carbon emission questions for Maria at the end. So with all of that, our agenda today is going to show us a little introduction, the technical methodology that Maria has worked really hard on, and then a use case demonstration. So with that, Maria, take it away.
Thank you so much, Candy. Let's go ahead and dive into an introduction, a little bit about what Scope 1, 2, and 3 is and what IMPLAN has to offer on environmental data and environmental impacts. So to give a little background on where we've been so far, environmental data and IMPLAN covers a range of categories. So you can see environmental outputs across these different categories for the underlying data of a region to get a sense of the carbon footprint across these categories for a given region. Or you can also see environmental outputs across these categories in our results to get the true environmental impact associated with your economic impact. For today, we're going to be focusing in specifically on greenhouse gases. So those greenhouse gases we have in IMPLAN for US projects are in kilograms of greenhouse gases for those specific types. So kilograms of methane or kilograms of carbon dioxide. We then get global warming potential data from recipe to then convert those greenhouse gases into carbon dioxide equivalents. So that gives us a true kind of apples to apples comparison of all of our emissions. And we've been reporting those as direct, indirect, and induced CO2 equivalent emission impacts. We're really excited today to introduce our latest improvement in this area, which is Scope 1, 2, and 3 reporting, where we're recategorizing direct, indirect, and induced emissions into Scope 1, 2, and 3. So scope-based emission reporting is super important and relevant right now because government-imposed mandates are growing more and more common around the world. These mandates are requiring large businesses and corporations to report their Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Most relevant to the data that we have rolled out so far is the upcoming US-based mandate. California's Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act, or SB 235, will require corporations with over $1 billion in annual revenue to report their Scope 1 and 2 emissions starting in 2026. and Scope 3 in 2027. This requires third-party verification with limited assurance, and then later on, we will require reasonable assurance by 2030. So the precision and level of accuracy is going to continue to advance, but next year, these corporations that have businesses and operate in California with over $1 billion in revenue will be required to start this reporting. They're not
Maria,
alone.
should we launch our first poll?
Yes, thank you so much, Candy. We'll roll a poll here, start getting input from you all, and we'll have a couple throughout our presentation. So please give us your input there. Thanks so much for all the input. Well, California is not alone in rolling out these mandates. Across the world, we see mandates emerging that are similar in structure in that they're requiring scope-based emission reporting. So we see a lot of these mandates are require scope 1 and 2 initially, and will start to kind of roll into that scope 3 as well. Similarly, you see here that the affected companies are based on size of company, with Canada being specific to actually the level of emissions being the requirement. So a lot of really interesting mandates to come, and it's speculated that California will lead a trend potentially in the US to see additional mandates come, but a lot of active ones already coming about in the landscape. So what are scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions? Scope 1 is the direct emissions from the owned or controlled sources. Scope 2 is the indirect emissions from energy consumption by the direct business or company or organization. Scope 3 is the other emissions due to activities from assets not owned or controlled by the reporting organization, such as their supply chain impacts. So in IMPLAN, to recategorize direct, indirect, and induced, we had to do some manipulation and recategorization of our impacts. Scope 1 was really easy. That's a one-to-one relationship with direct. So we'll see an equal relationship with direct emissions and Scope 1 emissions. For Scope 2, that is specifically the organization that is reporting their impact. It's their purchase of energy use. And so we need to tease out specifically that purchase by using power series. Power series is a way to quantify rounds of impacts individually. So we're using that here to then separate out Scope 2 from the remaining emissions, which are captured in Scope 3. So that's going to be all of our emissions outside of Scope 2 for indirect, plus our induced emissions.
Let's go ahead and launch our second poll.
Thank you for your input there. So what we do in IMPLAN is we're going to be delivering, we deliver Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions for all industries measured in those carbon dioxide equivalents. We display Scope 1, 2, and 3 across the 20-year, 100-year, and 1,000-year time horizon for global warming potentials. If you want to dive even deeper into industry level emission impacts, we have that available for the 100-year time horizon, which is the most common time period for reporting according to the EPA. So to get into a little bit more detail about how we're teasing out these Scope 2 and 3 impacts, I have this helpful graphic here. You should be able to see that in just a second here. So here on this graphic, I think you all might still be seeing the poll. Here we go. So this graphic is showing the accounting for electricity emissions throughout a supply system. This is a recreation from the GHG protocol, and it's showing us this supply system of how energy essentially flows from fuel production to actual energy consumption. Fuel is used to generate power, power is transmitted and distributed, and then finally consumed. So if we think about the majority of industries, they are energy consumers who purchase electricity through transmission and distribution, who then is supplied power by the power generation industry. So transmission and distribution is essentially a round one purchase in those power series I talked about earlier, and then the power generation is a round two purchase for that energy consumer. So we're isolating that round two impact on emissions from power generation to identify our scope 2 emissions for energy consumers. The transmission and distribution portion and the fuel production are both part of scope 3. So scope 2 is captured as that round two emissions in the analysis for the flagged energy industries. Scope 2 also includes direct emissions from utility industries. So if we look back at our graphic, we'll see if we jump up to the next tier here for utility energy distributors, we'll see that for transmission and distribution, that is considered scope 2 in that case. So that is why we're considering their direct impact scope 2. For power generation and fuel production, their direct emissions are also scope 1, similar to energy consumers. So that kind of talks specifically about electricity, but what else is going on with scope 3? Scope 3 is the remaining emissions. We talked about a few elements there. It's going to include all the indirect emissions other than scope 2 and the induced emissions. For commodity output events, when that's part of your analysis and you have margins there, those downstream impacts from factory floor to consumer are going to be considered scope 3. So retail, wholesale, and transportation margins will get categorized as scope 3 when they're included in your analysis. And then finally, any direct output for industries that produce some portion of the impacted commodity as a secondary commodity or a byproduct, that will also be captured as scope 3. So here's an image of the summary version of what you'll see for scope 1, 2, and 3. This is a basic analysis of just looking at a data center. And on the left-hand side is the more traditional categorization of direct, indirect, and induced. So what I'm demonstrating here is just that our totals of direct, indirect, and induced impacts for emissions is equivalent to the sum of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So the scope 1, 2, and 3 impacts we're presenting at this point are just recategorization of our existing impacts. As I said early on in this call, we've iteratively continued to evolve this, so we'll be sure to let you know when if any of these things change and we continue to layer things on for environmental emission reporting. Currently, you can see it's a recategorization of these impacts here. So why does this matter? Whether you're driving sustainability strategy or supporting a mandate compliance or assessing climate impacts on the community level, IMPLANs enhanced environmental data is going to allow you to align with global emission reporting standards, quantify emissions tied directly to an economic activity, explore long-term climate impacts with future-facing metrics, as we saw with the global warming potentials going out 100 years, even 1,000 years, and you can instantly access industry-level insights for targeted analyses. With that, we'll go ahead and launch one more poll here. All right, thank you all so much for the input on the polls. I'll let that close out for a second. This is our first time doing polls, and I should make sure that you all can see my screen as that poll ends. But we're going to transition into a couple use cases. For the sake of time, I've created these use cases as screenshots of how we will lay these out in the application. So we'll go through each of these. They'll increase in terms of the level of customization that you'll see as we move from left to right here. We'll get more advanced. So first, we'll start off with an industry standard emission impact. We'll run a basic impact using only output to provide a benchmark for the emissions in that targeted industry. Then we'll move on to actually making edits to the inputs that that industry is purchasing to allow us to really tailor that scope 2 and 3 emission based on the input purchases by that industry. Finally, we'll play with changing the regional energy mix so that we can actually update our model to reflect a new makeup of energy production in a region. This could be a hypothetical scenario of saying, well, what would this look like if our energy mix were to change in such a way? Or you can reflect a present day image of what the grid is in a specific region. So let's get started with the industry standard emission use case. I'll be looking at data centers, and the environmental impact associated with data centers is important and a common topic of conversation because it's an important consideration when considering the overall benefit of building more data centers. It's also important to think about when considering where to locate data centers, as well as how data centers can operate more efficiently. Data centers are expanding in places like the Dakotas to take advantage of the cool weather, reducing their demand on water and energy for keeping server components in the facility cool. So to start off with that standard impact, we'll look at the impact of opening a new data center in South Dakota that produces $1 billion of services annually. So here in my analysis, I've set this up with Industry 418, data processing, hosting, and related services with $1 billion of output. I've dropped that data center event into the South Dakota group and included the rest of the United States as the remaining region. I checked the MRIO box so we can link together South Dakota with the rest of the United States to get a nationwide impact. When I run this impact with just that $1 billion in the data processing industry in South Dakota, I get this economic impact. This is the economic impact that you're accustomed to seeing in IMPLAN. Here we have that $1 billion of direct output from the data center. And from that, we get just under $500 million of value added or contribution to GDP. And then altogether, the contribution to GDP is about $1.3 billion. We get our jobs impact, our labor income impact, and all the other impacts you're used to seeing when it comes to economic indicators. But in addition to that, we have the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions impacts like we saw recently. Here we're getting to see those kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents in scope 1, 2, and 3 across our different time horizons. So what we're doing here is converting all those different chemicals. You can imagine carbon dioxide, of course, has a ratio of 1 because we're converting everything into like units of carbon dioxide. But things like methane have more potency than carbon dioxide when it comes to global warming potential. And those different chemicals have different levels of global warming potential depending on the time period because of how those chemicals break down over time. So we get to see that 20-year, 100-year, and 1,000-year time horizon, with the 100-year being the most common, as I mentioned. So this gives us that overall, kind of standard emissions impact. So for the 100-year time horizon, we get just under 150 million kilograms of CO2. Dividing this by 1,000 gets us to metric tons, so about 150,000 metric tons of CO2 is what we see across that 100-year time horizon. So that's using just the little minimal information that we use. IMPLAN's industry production functions assume a fixed input structure. So the ratio of inputs that the data center will need in order to operate is consistent, and we then use the regional availability of inputs to tailor our impacts and to specifically find out where those inputs are going to be purchased from and where our impacts are really going to land. We further use the electricity information to determine how those impacts will split across the energy types. So we're using the distribution of energy production in a specific region to determine that mix. So what we're going to do next to kind of take this analysis a step further is to actually model the data center with reduced water and cooling and electricity demand and compare that global warming potential impact. So we're going to modify the inputs of electricity from 1.5% to 1%, and we're going to modify the input purchase of water, sewage, and other systems from 0.03% to 0.01%. So these edits can be made inside of our spending pattern. So before, all we entered was the $1 billion with industry 418 for data centers, and we didn't make any further edits. Now we're going to click into the spending pattern modal and make those edits we just spoke about. So here's what you would see once you click spending patterns. we'll see that 1.58% of input purchases is going towards electricity transmission and distribution. And we see that 0.03% going to water, sewage, and other systems. So from here, I'll edit those to 1% and 0.01%. Now my sum of percentages is less than 100%, so I'm going to normalize the spending pattern so that we keep these edits, but then redistribute the percentages on all of our other inputs so that this reaches back to 100%. So there's our final edits so that we have a complete distribution of our inputs across all of these, the spending pattern here. So we'll save that and run our impacts. And now we can get a comparison of those emissions impacts from the first analysis compared to what we see now. So I mentioned before the 150,000 metric tons. We are now at 140.3 or 140,346 metric tons in the case with these edits. So comparing our scope 2, we see that that jumped actually quite a lot from 180,528 kilograms of CO2 equivalents all the way down to 114,531. So if we do the comparison there, that's a 37% decrease in the scope 2 emissions with just a 5% decrease in our scope 3. So making those simple edits specifically to electricity brought down our scope 2 emissions, and then reducing our demand on water brought down that scope 3. That water, sewage, and other systems is going to include things like cooling as well. All right, so we'll shift now to this final iteration of modifications to our inputs, but now looking at it from a model perspective. So the way that we got those scope 2 emissions was specific, like I said, to the energy mix in South Dakota. Here we're looking at the balance sheets for electricity and seeing the industry institutional production of electricity. So here we see that the majority of electricity production in South Dakota in terms of dollar amounts is primarily fossil fuels, with 30% in wind and about 3.6% going to hydroelectric, and then another chunk going towards local government electric utilities. So let's imagine that as South Dakota welcomes in new data centers and potentially other businesses to create more of an industry chain within their region, let's imagine they continue to ramp up hydroelectric power. If we go into the customization of South Dakota, we can see that for electric power generation, for hydroelectric, there are just about 30 jobs in that industry in South Dakota in the underlying data. But if we continue to rev up output of that type of energy, let's imagine that employment jumps to 50. Our output is going to jump up in relation to that increase in employment to give us a new level of production of hydroelectric power. So once we rebuild this model, the South Dakota region will be reconstructed with this modification in it, and we'll give it a new name and compare to these previous relationships of power. So for South Dakota, for new hydroelectric, we'll see that 3.56% jump to just under 6% going to hydroelectric. And so if we were to rerun our analysis now using this new model, we'd get slightly different results, particularly in scope 2, as well as in the inputs that stem from this different type of energy purchase. So our scope 2 and scope 3 would change based on the type of energy available in the region. All right, so we'll transition into live Q&A here.
Great. Thank you so much, Maria. So we
Absolutely.
do have a few questions that came in, specifically on slide 29. Todd asked if the 0.58 over 1.58 equals 0.37. Is that all scope 2 reduction is?
The change from the 1.58 to the 1% here, essentially it is. So that this percentage here is the percentage of intermediate inputs. So the percentage of the industry that makes up is basically ending up with that 37% change. Uh, that's right. Since the electricity transmission and distribution purchase is what drives our scope 2 entirely.
Great, thank you. All right, Hassan asked, do you have any prediction regarding the impact of AI growth on the use of energy and its implications?
That's a great question. There's a lot of research out there, and we're definitely staying up to date on those different things. We don't have projections on that just yet, but definitely something we're staying tapped into. But as you collect data about that projection, these approaches are, good ways you can pump that data back into IMPLAN to see what the impacts of the potential, outlook of AI's impact will be.
Great, and I think on this same page, we got a question, how did you know to change from 1.58 to 1?
This was just a hypothetical example. So that's kind of the hard work that the analyst will need to do to determine that. The reason we positioned it that way was because these inputs are based on the national average of distribution of inputs from data processing and hosting. And we're assuming that the electricity here demanded for the industry on average in the nation is going to be a little bit lower for in terms of electricity demand when the data center is located in South Dakota because of the cooler temperature. But quantifying that amount would require us having actual inventory information from the data center that's opening up.
Great. All right, from Rachel, this is a couple part question. What about direct access customers? For direct access, does that affect how T&D pardon me, emissions are calculated? And for large energy customers who purchase carbon offsets, are those included in the IMPLAN totals?
For the secondary one, we do not have offsets included in there. Your scope 2 emissions can be, it gives you a sense of what your emissions are before any abatements. And then you could balance out that scope 2 by reducing it by whatever carbon reduction activity is happening. In terms of that first question, Candy, can you run that by me one more time?
Absolutely. What about the direct access customers? Does that affect how T&D emissions are calculated?
Direct access customers. So I can definitely chat more offline, but I would say for the direct access customers, what I think of there is the actual power generation or the transmission industry itself. And for transmission and distribution or T&D is treated a little bit differently when we're talking about utility providers. That is considered, what their direct emissions would be is considered scope 2 because of this allocation here, where the GHG protocol is recommending considering those utility providers, the actual transmission and distribution impact, considering that scope 2. Other direct consumers, or please let us know a little bit more details there. We can maybe chat more online if that goes beyond just utility providers.
Greenhouse gas protocol has its own definitions for scope 1, 2, and 3 that appear different than what you've shown. Are you concerned about any confusion among your users?
That's a great call out. We are aligned here. This is from GHG protocol, and we're aligned pretty closely there. So please let us know if there's any particular areas where there things look different that you're concerned about. But we have provided a ton of detail about how we're doing this on our support articles. And like I said, we will continue to evolve in terms of enabling users to make additional modifications. So this is always going to continue to evolve. And we're also going to work really hard to, follow along with the reporting requirements. So with 2026 being this first year, we'll be excited to hear what people are saying in terms of compliance reporting. So by and large, we're feeling good about having that communication on our support site and continuing to learn and continuing to align. But we have referenced the information from GHG protocol to get as best as aligned as we could be so far.
All right, great. Does IMPLAN allow one to change the CO2 equivalent coefficient per dollar of output generated? That is, what if there was a potential in a region's proportional supply of electricity from coal to solar that reduces the CO2 equivalent per dollar of output? Do we have the ability to change that?
Don't yet have the ability to change that. Definitely something that we're considering and have heard feedback on. So glad to hear that input, that may be a use case that the person with that question has, and something we'll continue to explore.
Awesome. And Julian, you had your hand raised. Do you want to unmute yourself? Maybe Julian said this is a case for where there are no imposed changes in utilization. All right, Nathan, you had your hand up. Nathan? No? Okay. Back to the question list. Is there a way to do this on a new data center that hasn't opened yet, or does the project already have to be established?
The project does not already have to be established in order for you to run an impact on that data center. The example we just did, if you have absolutely no information, come in with as much detail as you have about the amount of production that new data center will do. For example, in our case, we did the $1 billion of services per year. So if you can come in with a number like that, or say employment, the number of jobs that will be at the new data center, that gives you enough to start an impact and get an emissions impact associated with that. The more data you can get from that data center that's thinking about opening up is any data you can get on their bill of goods, so that you can do the kind of customizations we did here to more accurately depict their emissions and their economic impact. But you can absolutely do this with a potential data center. You can even run this in one region versus another and see what the difference in economic and environmental impacts will be in those two different regions. So this is a great tool for analyzing the hypothetical idea of new data centers opening, as well as the hypothetical change in energy and how that might affect things. We'll go way back to our Q&A slide. Any other questions we should hit, Candy?
Yeah, we have a few more. In our area, we have many CCA programs with low emissions factors. Are those used in your calculations on a local level? And how recent is the customer account data on what geographic level with industry specificity?
Yeah, great question. So our emissions data is derived from the EPA's environmental extended input output data, but we are using a national level of data and then converting that into ratios that we're then applying to each region. So one area that we're also looking into potentially expanding is incorporating state level data, but at this time those ratios for carbon intensity and those units per dollar of output are a national ratio.
Great. Julian is having trouble unmuting as well, but his question is, if there's a case where the IMPLAN just analyzed a case before, and the question is whether the totals change or just the allocations among the totals.
Oh, our first example, I think, is what that question is about, where we actually, the comparison here, the totals did actually change. So our scope 1 stayed exactly the same because we're still modeling that $1 billion of data center activity per year. So our scope 1 stayed exactly the same, but scope 2 went down 37% and scope 3 went down 5%. Scope 2 really is a much smaller portion, pretty small portion of the total emissions. So when you look at the total and compare those, it's about 5% difference as well, since Scope 2 doesn't make a huge impact with the magnitude difference there that you can see between Scope 2 and 3. But the totals do change as you look at that 100-year time horizon, global warming potential impact being at almost 150 million kilograms of CO2, where we have 140 million down here. Great question.
Will IMPLAN provide reference to current evolving estimates of the social cost of carbon or social cost of greenhouse gas emissions over time?
We recently compared our emissions, excuse me, our global warming potential conversions. We recently compared those to IPCC's most recent release of their ratios in that 6th edition, and they were very close. We will definitely continue to do that and probably do it in a more standardized way as we move forward. So yes.
Going back to Rachel's earlier question about the direct access folks, she pinged in and said, for instance, NetApp and Google, among dozens of other tech companies in Silicon Valley, are direct access customers through PG&E.
For direct access customers that are buying their energy maybe directly from the energy provider, I will need to look and do a little bit more research, but I think technically we'd want to modify those things in scope 1 since they're actually we would at that point maybe consider that an owned source if they're directly buying that energy from the provider. But I'll certainly do some more research on that. Let us know if you have any other information that we should be aware of. But scope 1 right now is not editable, but that is definitely something that we'll be working on layering in some capabilities there.
Great. Do we have a nationwide report that breaks energy using 1, 2, and 3 down by energy type for each state? In line with that, do you have the related subsidies related to each?
Oh no, that's not something we're offering at this time. That's a very interesting thing that we can look into.
Okay. Can you explain a little bit more about the 10, 100, and 1,000 year scenarios?
Yeah, absolutely. So 20, 100, and 1,000 years, that is, if you look at the conversions themselves of, translating, say, methane or some other greenhouse gas into a carbon dioxide equivalent, those ratios are different depending on the time horizon of 20, 100, and 1,000 years. If you look at methane, for example, its ratio of global warming potential per kilogram is actually starts to decline the further you go out because it's more of one of those short-term gases that breaks down. So the importance of this is just depends on your view in terms of climate risk, in terms of what scenario is most important to you. The 100 years is really common because in the next 100 years, the next generation will be here to experience whatever conditions the climate is in. And so it's more meaningful to folks to think about how their kids or their grandkids might live their life. 100 years is important in terms of financial planning. 20 years might be more important in terms of financial planning. So depending on the objective or the perspective of your analysis, these different time horizons might be more important. 1,000 years is relevant in terms of the more long-term trajectory of our planet. So 1,000 years kind of gives people more of a more of a lens in the case that they're thinking about long-term ecosystem changes. And long-term impacts on conditions of the planet. So that gives you a little bit of background, but the data behind those are specific to how those chemicals break down. Essentially, what is the half-life of all of our greenhouse gases so that we can determine what is its global warming potential depending on how far out into the future we're looking.
companies like Meta that build their own solar?
That one will come back to that scope 2 consideration. If a company is building its own energy, that absolutely is considered scope 1. And a tweak that you'll want to make to essentially tease out some of the electricity purchases that they make so that they don't have as much scope 2, but you would need to account for those things in scope 1. So we hope to launch, something that a platform interface that essentially lets you put more of that information in as we continue to evolve these offerings. But that's how you would categorize it. Whenever you have those directly owned sources of energy, they should be considered scope 1, and you should tailor your environmental impact based on that.
Great. Two-parter from Allison. Does this feature and IMPLAN require an upgraded subscription? That's part 1. And part 2, my understanding is that IMPLAN does not have data for emissions related with public tariff and transportation patterns. Is that accurate?
For the part 1 question, at this time, you are able to try out the scope 1, 2, and 3 reporting. I don't know if you want to speak to timeline, but at some point, we expect that to be a gated offering as we continue to evolve that solution.
That is my understanding as well.
Great. Okay. And the second question, please run it for me one more time. I didn't quite catch.
Absolutely. It's my understanding that IMPLAN does not have data for emissions related with public tariff and transportation patterns. Is that accurate?
Tariff and transportation patterns. You will see nothing specific to tariffs, if I heard that correctly. For transportation, each transportation mode in IMPLAN will have its own emissions per dollar of output. We do have, transportation industries in IMPLAN if you're looking to actually impact those directly, but you will have emissions associated with transportation built into any sort of environmental impacts you're doing in IMPLAN, and we've got spending patterns specific to those industries to make similar modifications as what you saw in demonstration today. But aside from that, we do have those national ratios on an industry basis that we're getting our emissions from. Really great questions. Thank you, everyone.
Another question from Jorge this time. Is it possible to do a similar analysis at a sub-state level, like a county?
Absolutely. You can certainly do your impacts at a sub-state level. We recommend, using that multi-regional input-output approach where I included the surrounding regions so that you're making sure to capture all of the emissions that were associated with what's going on in your county. But absolutely, you can run an impact where the events are happening in that county. And your scope 2 will reflect energy that was purchased from inside the county as well as outside of the county, as long as you include those surrounding regions.
Great. From Sam, does the model have the ability to measure emissions from land use change or management?
We do have data about land use. We don't have emissions data about, the change in terms of carbon sinks as a result of that land use at this time. But you will be able to find data about, the area of land used, as well as information about the type of land used. So for example, if there's a lot of land use as associated with your impact in terms of forest, you're certainly going to have a serious impact on emissions by eliminating any sort of forest carbon sinks. So if you have any data outside of IMPLAN, you could certainly relate that land area square footage based on the type of land into additional emissions. That's not data we've layered in at this time, but gives me another area to explore. I think that's a very interesting one.
Great. And from Steve, who I think just raised his hand, can you discuss which category pollutants you account for in your emissions modeling? This would be helpful to know when reporting emissions output values to clients.
When I'm reporting emissions, sorry, what was the last word there, Candy?
When they're reporting the emissions output values to the customers.
Okay. And that was specifically around air pollution.
What category pollutants?
So I'll go back to our categories. You'll see emissions from all of these categories. So like I said, the greenhouse gases will be in those kilograms. Most of these are in kilograms of output for these various indicators. So land use is one of them, like we just talked about. And then you also have these criteria and hazardous air emissions. Those are super common to be reported when you're considering air quality, as well as all of these other indicators that get into, water, depending on what your client is most interested in. You can report outputs on any one of these categories. We'll have emissions associated with all of these in the results. So today we focused on greenhouse gases, but you'll see a summary with data for all of these categories.
All right, we'll do one last question. If we didn't get to your questions, hang tight. We will follow up with you individually. If you have a specific question, you can always reach out to us at support@implan.com or sales@implan.com. Be happy to get back to you with any questions, even if we have to bring Maria in and answer some technical things for us. But let's do one more. In our area, oh, no, how does the model deal with importation of electric power? Some states are exporters, others are importers. Is imported power based on actuals or the national average?
Yeah, great question. So our imports and exports in IMPLAN are based, that's our bread and butter that we've really had the gold standard on for a long time, which is looking at regional trade data that is all the way down to the zip code. So all that information about exports and imports of energy and how we're determining where the energy output is coming from, that is all based on our highly regionalized data.
All right, with that, we are out of time today. Thank you everyone who was able to join us. If you click in the upper right-hand corner, there's a paper with a little paperclip on it. You can download one of IMPLAN's newest white papers on scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Visit our blog by checking this out right here. As I mentioned, feel free to reach out to us at any time. You are welcome to email support@implan.com for our existing customers, sales@implan.com for people who are interested in purchasing or have any general requests. Or if you just want to get a demo, you can head over to our website, implan.com/demo-request, and submit a form there, and someone will be in touch with you. So on behalf of the entire IMPLAN team, especially Maria Lucas and all of the people who joined us today, thank you for everything and have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you, Candy. Thanks all. Take care.